This is a Moving Biography podcast, bringing together different perspectives to question disciplinary assumptions and decentre life writing. It is a collaboration between LAWHA at the Orient-Institut Beirut, the American University of Beirut, and the Global Decentre, generously funded by the Volkswagen Foundation.
I'm Kirsten Scheid and am speaking with Daniel Schönpflug, who I met about a year ago when you, Daniel, joined a summer school that we were hosting here in Beirut, hosted by LAWHA and by the American University of Beirut and by the Orient-Institut of Beirut and the Global Decentre. So Daniel, first, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, so thank you so much for having me. My name is Daniel Schönpflug, as we would say it in German. I'm on the one hand a historian teaching history at the Freie Universität of Berlin. And on the other hand, I have a more administrative position at the Wissenschaftskolleg, which is a Berlin Institute for Advanced Study, where I work as the head of academic programs.
Thanks so much for joining and making time to speak today with me, Daniel. I've been wanting to talk with you since last summer at our summer school because of your fascinating work bridging what I think of as conventional history and maybe even book-oriented biography with the kind of blood and guts of life. At the summer school, you were one of the keynote speakers, and you talked about having been tasked to write a 200th anniversary birthday, not death day, right? For
Death Day.
Napoleon? Death day, okay. And before we get into that, I was wondering if you could tell listeners more about how you generally have worked on history. What kind of historian are you, and why have you produced 4 monographs that are all biographies?
Yeah, so I was trained, you can say, in the outskirts of Bielefeld here in Germany as a reference that really has somehow structured the study of history. Bielefeld School came up in the late 60s, mainly 70s, and was a school that was looking at social history, structural history, history of social groups. And I was trained in that fashion, but then also part of this younger generation of Bielefeldian scholars who then got interested in microhistory and the history of culture, and who worked with the older approaches in a quite creative way. I think what helped me to do this was also the fact that I was never in Bielefeld itself, but was always in Berlin, where some of the more prominent members of the Bielefeld schools were teaching. But that also meant that I had a liminal position towards that school, and that gave me some freedom. So why are all my books biographies? They're all biographies in very different senses. Let's say my PhD was on radicalization processes in the Strasbourg Jacobin Club. But if you look at it closely, it's actually a biography of the 1,200 Strasbourgers who were members of this club. And I look into their social composition, how they interacted politically, but I also try to learn a lot about them individually. So in this sense, it's a social history book, but the prosopography, so the looking at individual characters, is very important, and it already has a biographical, let's say, taste to it. And while I'm working through different other topics, the biography becomes more and more important. And that also has to do with the fact that I've worked a lot with documentary film production. And as the documentary film is often very attractive as in biography.
The biopic, yes. They come out in slews and slews. And it must be mentioned that you have Netflix-worthy characters and stories that you've told that have certainly outsold many episodes of Netflix 8 series biographies. For example, the book about the Princess Louisa, right? Okay, so let's speed up ahead then to this commission that you received to work on Napoleon's death day, not on the day, but to come up with a book of his life, yet another biography of Napoleon for the 200th anniversary. And you presented that compellingly and with such sense of the struggle that you faced. Would you mind recounting how you initially recoiled from the idea and then found a solution long after your editor had given up hope?
Yeah, so I have to start with a confession. The book is not written yet.
Yes, I know.
So we're speaking about a book project,
Mm.
and a book project that I've struggled with more and longer than with others. And part of the problem was that you can always find reasons for not writing a book, especially in times of COVID and so on and so forth. There were many very mundane reasons for the book not making progress. But there was, I think, also a profound one, and that is that A, there are millions of biographies of Napoleon, and B, it is in a certain way almost impossible to write a biography of Napoleon because you never get access to that man. It has to do with the kind of sources that Napoleon has left. Most biographies are written on the base of the hundreds, maybe thousands of reports on his life that people around him have written. But these reports all have an agenda. Most of them have the agenda to glorify the man. A few have the agenda to glorify the author, and some have the agenda to criticize Napoleon. But it is never, you always feel very strongly that this writing about the man is instrumental. Then Napoleon left quite a considerable collection of sources himself. There's a legacy, but none of this gives you any access to the man. It is hermetic. Right. Even
Daniel,
his love letters.
Could you take a step back and explain what you mean by the man here? You have access to words, to actions, to sequences of events and his presence in them. But what is escaping when you say you don't have access to the man?
The person doesn't come alive. Let's think that, like, for example, you would think that some of the most personal traces that someone leaves, like personal letters to loved ones, to, especially to his wives or the women he loved, would reveal something. But it's not the case. Even love letters just seem copied from some Enlightenment novel, and they're so polished and stylish that you don't get any sense of a person, of a personality. It's just someone who is hiding away, someone who's so conventional that you can't grasp, and you couldn't possibly. A biography needs personality, and this is so crafted, so as if every letter, every word, every order he gave was already in the idea to contribute to that image he wanted to give to posterity. So
it's like AI had already been invented.
Exactly.
And was doing Napoleon.
Exactly. You're talking to a chatbot, and there's nothing really interesting, and that is really a block. And there's someone who wrote about him, said the closer you get to Napoleon, the farther you move away from him. So even with these most intimate documents, you don't really get a hold of him. And this was a frustration, and many biographers have felt it. Some have made up their own personality just by inventing it. Some have intelligently written about these projected images that others or he himself wanted to paint. But it is a frustrating constellation to write a biography. And so this was something that frustrated me, blocked me, because for my other more biographical writing, there was always a feeling. You mentioned the biography of Queen Louisa. I mean, I don't claim I knew her, but there I had a personal relation with her, even through her letters, through her sources, through their diaries and so forth. I could somehow feel her. There's no way feeling Napoleon. You can't feel that man. He doesn't he doesn't give you a starting point, no entry point. It's impossible. So
what would have been an entry point for another person? Be love letters, or like with the princess, the queen?
Even in the writings of Princess and then Queen Louise, they're very emotional, and something that touched me and somehow draw me into these are the mistakes, because she's forced often to write in French, but her French is not really good. And she also uses the French that probably was common at court at that time, that mixes languages. So she would start in French, then slip into German, sometimes slip into dialect, her home dialect with the northern dialect, or even Berlin dialect that she learned when she came to Berlin. And this is so personal and so individual, and it really gives you you hear it. When you read her letters, something comes across. And she's very spontaneous in her letters. And this, at least seemingly, it gives the biographer some kind of an entry point.
That somebody's figuring out how to be, right? Okay.
Yeah. The imperfections.
Okay. So what was your ultimate, or what do you think is going to be your entry point that you presented for us at that summer school?
So there was a moment when I really felt that there could be a way, and that was when I came across a set of sources that's not completely unknown, but it was unknown to me. And those were the reports about the autopsy of Napoleon's body after his death in May 1821. And the autopsies happened for a number of reasons. The Brits mainly wanted to make the point that they hadn't poisoned him, they hadn't killed him in any way. On the French side, there was also a lot of hagiography going on. So it was the body of the emperor was an almost sacred object. It needed this deep inquiry in order to sanctify it, to mark the transition to a new state. But these sources struck me because, of course, there were also narrative about the man, and depending on the interest of the author, there was also an agenda. But they somehow revealed the brute fact of a body, a dead body. And the dead body in many ways contradicted the heroic narratives. One contradiction that the autopsy shows is that when the doctors looked at Napoleon's skin, they would actually see scars. And these scars were often moments of danger, moments where Napoleon had almost died. For example, there was a burn on the skull. And this must have been from the fire of Moscow, so hot ashes landing on his head. Or there was a huge hole in his calf. This is where a halberd had actually struck him in his early days. And
halberd is like one of those swords at the end of.
It's like a lance, I think, like a pike.
Okay.
So it's a stabbing arm. And the wound was so bad, he acquired a fever that he could have died, and his leg was almost amputated. And in the end, he survived, but it left a hole big in his calf, big enough to put a fist into. So it was quite a wound.
Wow.
And these and other wounds would refer to death. He had almost died. And these deaths could be referred to this heroic attempt to risk your life, to be a full-blown general who is really waging everything for the victory. On the other hand, the autopsy revealed that Napoleon did actually die of a stomach cancer. And this is the most unheroic death that someone like Napoleon could dream of. So the body, like a level of observation, goes beyond the narratives. It questions the heroic and very polished narratives that exist. And this is why I thought it was an interesting starting point. And so I decided to write a biography that starts off from the scars, and each scars would lead me to an anecdote about how Napoleon almost dies. And this is actually an interesting reflection far beyond the man, because the art of dying is completely renewed, rethought, relived in the revolutionary age, and dying becomes a patriotic duty for the activist, for the soldier. Live free or die is one of the core slogans of the French Revolution, and it structures the political discourse. What's interesting is that while so many occasions Napoleon almost dies because the bullet whizzes by, because the horse is shot but not the man, and so on and so forth, millions of men do actually die. And it's not only his body in that sense, but also their bodies. Millions of dead bodies, mutilated often, in terrible state, suffering in ways that are just horrible to read about. It's also their bodies that tell a different story of that time.
And as I recall, you didn't just read about them, but you looked at paintings of the battlefield. Can you talk about, I'll just take a sidestep here to say, I was trained originally in art history and then moved to anthropology. And I always thought it was weird that art history was segregated from history, that it was not just the history of art, but that it was history through art, and that as if historians didn't need to know about art. So like art historians needed to know about history, but because their art was always supposed to be historical material, if you wrote about contemporary stuff, you were just a critic. But the rest of the world didn't really need to know about art to do history. And so it was a moment of great surprise for me when I was attending your lecture, your keynote lecture, to hear that you said you turned from these reports and these textual sources, and you looked at images, kind of like looking in a different way to think about this person who is available to us in history only as an image, in fact, to mean a fleeting thing, to mean something, what Marx would have called now I'm forgetting, the idée fixe. Mm-hmm. And so something without substance, perhaps. But you found more substance in the way you told it, and even the kind of tenor of your voice as you were telling it, when you looked at these paintings and saw these bodies row upon row.
Yes, so you're absolutely right. In the classic historical training, images play a very minor role. They're often simply illustrative. And then, of course, there's a branch of historians who are better at that, who read what art historians have to say, what art critics have to say, and they make better use of images as full-blown sources that also need a critical method, just like any other source. For me, the discovery of images came late. It had to do with the film business, because there you work with images all the time, and the film business is really bad at using images, actually. They use them for purely illustrative reasons. And then I was lucky to have a friend who kept dragging me to museums. Wherever we went, we would always... And I started to see hundreds and thousands of paintings and photographs and so on and so forth. And then the machine started to work on it. And in the case of the Napoleon biography, I realized that there were different kinds of images. So these images that depict Napoleon who almost dies. And this is part of a political narrative. But then also other images that are actually showing these dead bodies that can be a signpost to a different narrative. And one of those is Jean-Pierre Gross' painting of the Battle of Preußisch Eylau, 1807, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, okay.
And Gross gets commissioned to paint one of these huge historical paintings of Napoleon after the battle, the victor. And he takes the commission But instead of rendering, exactly, this is it. Instead of rendering the moment of victory, he actually uses the information he has about this battle, which is one of the bloodiest and most terrible of the whole Napoleonic Wars. He uses it to really show a huge amount of dead bodies, and you see some of them in the forefront. But if the reproduction of the painting was better, you would see rows of dead bodies also in the back. I can't see them as well. And he also paints, no, yes, exactly there. These more on the left are actually like rows and piles of dead men. Also, if you look at the emperor, he doesn't look so victorious. He looks very pale.
Right.
He has his eyes turned to the sky, as almost as if as asking for mercy or forgiveness. Especially, I think, if you look at the eye of the horse, it is pure horror. It is almost like the eye of the dying man in the foreground, a depiction of massive fear of death, and yeah, it is an ecstasy of horror. And so exactly this eye plus the eye of the horse, I think, is a way of commenting what is actually not a victory.
I'm trying to just show the way they call each other. Due to the composition and the lighting, your eye is sent back and forth between them.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was for you the possibility to, okay, we could say that Napoleon's body is the one thing that got away from his image control, and that painters also, by reading and by being allowed to use their imagination, not his image projection, could sometimes evoke other understandings of the vulnerability of the many bodies at stake in these campaigns. I don't remember if Jean-Pierre Gros is the one who accompanied Napoleon, but I know that he hired artists to go along with him on his campaigns to get them to be able to send back rapid reports. But it is striking that this doesn't get censored, that it's allowed to have its life, to be available, to undermine, if looked at carefully, the story of this ever triumphant military strategist. But to think more about materiality and your work, I was wondering if you could go back to the earlier case that you pointed out to me of using learning from images for your research. And now I have to there we go, which was your book, A World on Edge. I think that's the first one, where working with paintings, the mind, you said your mind, first of all, there should be a limit on how long people are allowed to be in museums. And I say this as a survivor. I used to love being in museums for hours and hours, but by the time I had my own kids, I realized that an hour and a half was the maximum. People should not be in there more than that, because you really can't. I think you can't process them anymore. I think there is something when we are allowing all of our senses to engage with the learning being open to us that just makes it exhausting, but it does embed it in us, perhaps all the better. And I'm glad you got dragged to museums. Like, hooray to your friend for doing that. And I'm glad you got out also, so you could then take a breath and think how they would fit into your text. And The World on Edge features at the beginning another image. And I'm just going to put it on screen and let you talk about it, Daniel. Okay.
Yes, this is actually the painting that opens chapter 1. And it's a good starting point to speak about how paintings, images actually influence my writing. And I think they did in 3 different ways. One way is that they inform my writing process. So this first chapter is about the finishing weeks of the First World War. And so I would look at paintings like this and photographs and other things to inform my writing and to they correspond, of course, with the written sources. I would also put on music of the time while I was writing. I would actually copy some of these paintings into my file in order to see them all the time while I was writing. So let's say I look at Nash, I listened to Schönberg's Jacob's Ladder, which is also composed in exactly that moment and after an experience. And if you look at the text, it's very military. And then I would have the sources around me. And with all that atmosphere, the writing would have a certain intensity.
So you're not writing just from words and trying to figure out how to test this word against that, cross-check or verify. You're writing with this infusion of the energies that people had put into other sensuous material. Or
I think for an intensive text, you want to stimulate yourself in a certain way. And so images, music, and reading can create the stimulus. And then the important thing is to create, I think, an intense text is also the art of letting go, having all this around you, incorporating it, but then switching off control for a moment and let the text flow out based on the stimulus. And this often can produce like texts that have good energy, strong energy. But then there's a second use, I think, a second sense of that, of an image like this. And this is the illustrative sense. And I don't want to underestimate it, because I think if you give the reader a text and image that correspond, it will certainly intensify the kind of identification or perception, the cognition of what you're trying to tell. But then there's a third way, and I'm doing it not enough, but I'm doing in the book as well, is using these same images that have been an inspiration in the first place and then an illustration in the second place, also using them as riddles or puzzles or thought pieces. And the Nash painting at first is just a war landscape. But then you see the title, which is "We Are Making a New World." And then you ask yourself, okay, so there's the image of a completely wrecked landscape with burnt trees sticking out almost like totem poles. And he says, okay, we are creating a new world. So after you've seen this title, then you realize that there's actually a wonderful, beautiful sunrise happening in the back of the picture. And the light in the picture is not at all gloomy or destructive. It is very bright. And then you start to realize that the colors, the ground is not brown or black as you would think wrecked or destroyed landscape would look like, but it's actually green. It's quite beautiful shades of green. And the mountains in the back have a very beautiful brownish color. There's a lake that you realize in the back that is blue in the morning light. As a puzzle or thought piece, this painting actually offers a quite fierce contradiction between destruction on the one hand and new beginning on the other. And this is something that you explore on that third level.
And there's this flatness.
Yes.
Here, the horizon, I take it they're mountains, right? But there's no depth. It's just sheer color contrast here. Those are vivid, contrasting colors. But once you go up, the artist has actually added these sun rays and shown you their effect in place of in place of the use of one point perspective. So you see these lines that are somewhat parallel but will converge on this center point there. And you start to get the shading, and you start to get on the ridge also the lighter spots that indicate depth, that indicate some space to move towards if this seems like a huis clos, like a complete wall of nothingness. It's not even, it's such a void that it's not like you could even bump your head against it. Yeah. So thinking with that can open up for a historian who's also comfortable with biographic method and thinking how people were living through this can open up what people had to figure out, what would have been unclear, what the riddles that they were sharing with each other, or the way they approached life as a riddle. Perhaps, yeah?
Yeah, no, I'm listening with fascination. I think you're making a good point here.
The other work, or did you want to say more about this and your method?
Just that I'll have to run at one sharp.
Okay. So yeah, let's wrap up then. This has been, to me, this has been really interesting for thinking about what materiality does when it seeps into a form like biography, which encapsulates materials and life and their vulnerability, their birth, and then frailty. People die and such. But you're describing also a very different process when you work with non-textual materials. Has it made you think about being a historian and biographer differently? This work with these other materials, has it changed your sense of your task or what you must absolutely do?
So what I try to do is, yes, all my books are one way or another biographical, but they are biographical in completely different ways. My ambition would be, or maybe it's just because I'm getting bored so easily, to have a different kind of form or genre of biography each and every time I start a new project. And definitely the work with images has opened up a new dimension. And it is something that once I started it, it has stayed with me, something that I've not abandoned. But with each attempt, I would also try to do things a little differently. And the fact that this Napoleon project will certainly not look like a biography like the Queen Louise book did, but will more look like a biographical essay that uses textual and visual material to make a certain point about death around 1800 is part of that quest to not only start new projects on a content level, but also to embark on an experiment formally each time I start a new book.
So working with the spaces that materials leave.
And the older I get, the more free I am.
Yes, that is one of the joys of getting old, to all our young listeners. Just you wait. You'll have so much fun. Okay. Thanks so much, Daniel, for your time.
Oh, thank you for that conversation. It was really eye-opening in the true sense of the word.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Kirsten. Bye.
Hi, Yvonne. So
Hi,
I am Kirsten Scheid, and I was one of the co-organizers of a summer school last year at which I met you and was immediately enwrapped by your research and wanted to talk with you more about it. So I'm very happy that we have this chance through the help of afikra to talk a bit about why you came to our Moving Biographies summer school and your very original research into the biography of a journal, an Arabic journal, literary, cultural, and political journal. But first, Yvonne, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
About myself? Yeah.
Yeah.
First, thank you very much for this invitation. And my name is Yvonne Albers. I am currently a postdoctoral researcher at a big research project in Berlin, which is basically on global literature, it's called. But they also welcome people like me who are not doing literary studies in the narrow sense. I am trained in theater studies and philosophy, and then specialized in Arabic theater literature and cultural history of the 20th century, basically. I formerly worked also on performance arts, but then during my doctoral research, I delved into something completely different. Actually, an object I thought I would never be interested in, which is a periodical. I don't know how you feel about it, but thinking back when I started this, doing like a research on a magazine is something that was considered to be quite dull. You have this huge amount of paper, it's very hard to find a structure how to talk about it. And yeah, I don't know, it hasn't been something very fashionable when I started thinking about it let me think back, around 2013, 14. I think it started that I decided for that project. Yeah, and then I ended up to think it's one of the most fascinating objects in cultural history.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I was thrilled when you joined our summer school with this project studying the periodical Waqf. How long did it run?
It ran for pretty much more than 25 years, from 1968 to 1994.
And I just want to say, before you get to tell us more about it, that I had experience with the literary magazine Al Adab. It was run by my in-law family, and so I'm familiar with the editorial and the printing process of these like bits of technology that just never seemed to get together on time to let the magazine come out on time. And then one of my very first students when I started teaching at AUB in the master's program, Najib Ali, chose to work on a pioneer periodical related to AUB, but spread around the world, Al-Muqtataf. And probably just because I was so much into performance studies myself, I pushed her to use performance theory to think about the magazine as doing things, and in particular scripts and fonts, styles of rhetoric, like thinking of the beb, the column that a magazine has as an act, and part of a series of acts that together create a play for, in her case, modernity and science and actually technology too, as I looked at that magazine's impact and capacity to be alive. So to me, it made sense, but you're right. It's incredibly rare. And it's exciting to think about how you move from performance studies or performance art and theater into this flattened, I guess in comparison to theater, it's like just the script. It's not being enacted in the different places around the Arab world. We know how important theater was for developing a modern Arab imaginary. So I wanted to ask you to tell us more about this project studying Muwaqif and what made you start to think of it as some kind of entity, albeit collective, that could be best approached as having a biography. So a non-human agent whose life unfolding you could tell as a biography. Can you talk about that, please?
I could talk about that quite long, actually. I would even like to talk about the theater metaphors, but maybe we come to that later. So, yeah, I can maybe start with the moment when it started and when I was confronted with the material. So the first was the decision to work with that particular magazine, just because it was you can say that it was very exceptional, and maybe not as much exceptional because in the way how its former producers have considered it to be exceptional for the position it has in historical and cultural discourse and the debates it inspired, and that too, but also it has been quite unique in the way how the editorial board has been composed. So there is this huge changing group of today very well-known names from literary and cultural history and philosophy. I just drop a few here. So it was founded by Adonis and Khalida Said, but there have also been Kamal Abu Deeb, Samia Sayer, Ilyas Khouri, Edward Said, Mahmoud Darwish for a time. So they were all more or less involved.
Outstanding figures in Arab intellectual, philosophical, political thought.
It was a huge cast, So that is one thing. But then the other thing is it ran for quite a long time, 25 years. I think it has just been a longer run. Al Adab is one example who has a longer run, but usually it is very exceptional, as usually these kind of magazines live for 2 or 3 years, maybe tops. And it has been also exceptionally important for the connection between the Mashriq and the Maghreb, which was not something very usual for Beiruti magazine to do this bridge. Anyway.
And it had editors from both the Mashriq and the Maghreb, right?
From the start, yeah. But then when Mawaqif was published from exile in Paris, due to the community in Paris, Arab intellectual community there in the 90s, there were more Maghrebi intellectuals who joined. Anyway, but so I had this huge material, and the first thought how to tell a history or to tell a story actually of this magazine, one of the first thought came to my mind was, okay, I'm writing a biography. But at that point, it was not theoretically or methodologically reflected by myself. I just said I would do that. And then I entered...
But take a step back. That's not the obvious thing to say, oh, I'm writing a biography when you're dealing with 25 years that are dispersed across so many different people, places. The magazine changes format a bit, no?
Yeah, it changed. It changed
right?
a
so
lot.
What makes you think biography?
Biography,
writing of life. Yeah.
So the first thought was, okay, what do I have here? Obviously, I don't have a living human being here. I have an object here, but not an object like an antique vase or something, but an object that basically exists of 74, in the case of Mawaqif, 74 different issues. And an object stretched over time, over a period of 25 years, with a cast that was changing itself. So I was confronted with a problem: how can I at all tell a story of this thing, of this very peculiar serial thing? And it was basically the idea: how do I tell a biography of an object that is stretched in time as object, as material? But still, then it was very unreflected, and starting to think more about my own term when I say I'm writing a biography, I get aware of the fact that it is a very tricky metaphor, in fact, because it is always the assumption I am talking about a living being. And German sociologist Matthias Jung pointed to the fact that there are actually two major flaws with the biography of the object. The one is that we often are not aware enough that it is a metaphor, and the other that it is a narrative that we create. But in the case of the magazine, I found there is a peculiarity that it's not just me who says I'm writing a biography, but magazines in general are treated in historical discourse like as if persons, if you want. They are not just subjectified by me writing as a historian, writing a biography, but they're also treated like persons, in fact. You know this from Al-Adab, maybe. Sentences from literary studies, like Al-Adab has supported Arab nationalism. Al-Adab has done this or that. And this is basically the fact for each and every cultural magazine. And not just for the Arab world.
So this kind of anthropomorphization that happens by treating it as having a biography then allows you to cast onto it a singularized agency, and Matthias Jung is pointing out that can be a slippery slope when you treat the magazine itself as having this unified voice or intentional power. So the trick of thinking of it as a biography was to help you make it somehow manageable, but then how do you avoid those problems associated with making a biography by returning to what I'm hoping we really can focus on, which is the materiality of those 75 issues, for example. And I cut you off, so please feel free to continue what you were thinking first.
No, actually, you dropped a very important term here, which is anthropomorphization. And that was exactly my entry, how to turn biography, not like from the tricky metaphor, into a very useful and productive method for this endeavor. And I have maybe to say before I answer to your question on the materiality, that I found that the reasons why a magazine is notoriously anthropomorphized in discourse, so by their very producers, but also in historical retrospective, is first because they are understood often synonymously with its main editor. That can happen, especially when the main editor is very charismatic, like Adonis, or let's say in the case of Al-Karim al-Mahmoud Dawish, then it's very easy to see them in personal unity, but also because the magazine itself has a very peculiar function in the cultural field, because it is done by a or it usually represents a collective endeavor, which is then personalized under the name of the magazine. And the self-fashioning of these kind of cultural magazines works through anthropomorphizing itself in a way, through personalizing itself.
So it's like a band.
It's like a band, but then
like the Rolling Stones, or
yeah, maybe you could say that. And then of course its title is not so much a title as it is a name. So a magazine, and this is the kind of self-fashioning every magazine does. A magazine wants to be understood as a coherent being, as doing following consistently the same mission over a long period of time. So this is the self-fashioning part. But on the material level, the magazine is able to subvert this kind of self-fashioning, to subvert its own narrative of being a consistent self that has a particular aim. And it is exactly because it is produced collectively, but also due to the fact that if we look how a particular issue is produced, right? So when we today read a magazine issue, we would, as historians, we would love to see the intention of each and every article and picture and image that is put into this one issue. But in fact, it can be a long series of coincidences how one issue come into being, and we will never be able to reconstruct this.
Yeah, like the layout guy can't make everything fit, and so they have to cut an article that was expected to continue to be there, or they have to put in an ad to fill the space.
One of 100 reasons, right?
Yeah. Okay. So when you say the magazine itself subverts this self-fashioning, I think you mean that as a researcher, you can keep your eye close to other facets of the magazine that escape that easy folding into the biography. Yeah, it's easy to focus on, it's tempting to focus on the charismatic editor, or to think of the editor-in-chief or the publishing house as the ones that are extended through the magazine. It's just them, their beings with their ideas, they're as individuals who extend themselves out through the magazine. But you're saying that once a researcher starts to look at the production of the magazine, put the issues next to each other and notice things about them, that materiality gives you a chance to step away from this kind of easy mapping or the easy conversion metaphor of the magazine as a person. Hence, the magazine has a biography.
Yeah, in a way. So as you are in a way try to, no, you're right. It is possible to do that, but then in the same time, you have 100 different options to tell the biography of this very object. You have 100 options to tell the biography of the same human being as well. But in the case of the magazine, it seems to be like even more doors to just enter through. And I could have totally be written a biography on the magazine Mawaqif just through the lens of its main editor-in-chief, Adonis. I could do that. And partially it is what I've done, because he has been so prominent and important. But then it gives you so many other options to focus on. This is, of course, exactly the challenge when you look at the material. And so what I did, of course, I created a narrative that I deem to be like a relevant one, or one that is in a way representative for the lifetime of this object. And I focused on what I call dense years, dense moments of the magazine history. But what does dense mean? Dense in this case means that there has been an issue, for example, that has been in my view, very formative for what happened afterwards.
The issue of the magazine,
Issue of the
like
magazine.
a topic.
an issue of the magazine. For example, when in 1979, Mawaqif reacted on the Iranian Revolution, and it was one of the cultural magazines that embraced the revolution for a moment. And editors like Adonis and Elias Rodi exposed themselves as being optimistic for that. Of course, they later took it back, and there was the criticism of Sadiq Jalal al-Ghazm, who has also been an editor. And after this issue on the Iranian Revolution, a lot of things changed within the magazine. So the editorial board was not portrayed on the very first page as a group, but they reduced it to two main editors. So the collective spirit of the magazine vanished for a couple of years. So I try to look at moments where, on several levels, on the discourse level, on the structural level, and even on the level of design, a change seemed to happen, a shift. And so there was one.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, that was one of my approaches to tell the story, or to structure the story, because it's just a story.
That is great. And that takes me to my next question, which I'm interested in because of my own research as an anthropologist of art, where for me, art is not simply the expression in material form of ideas already formulated and done and being then communicated, like art's just a vessel, but rather the materiality of the art brings something new to the interactions. And I think this is similar to what you were saying about how the ways of producing a magazine require us to admit that there's happen chance. Nobody controls all the circumstances, even if they intended to. So in a way, there are no individuals here. There's people interacting with kind of porous boundaries, if we were still to stick with the strict metaphor of the biography. But now I'm thinking about your working method, because in this case, you had to go and find those copies of issues. So you're saying there are 75. And I don't know how many people know that there were 75 if they're numbered that way, but how many people actually have all 75 issues anywhere? So I'm wondering, how were you able to assemble the material, and how were you then able to get away from a very reductionist idea that a magazine is just paper between two covers and it just keeps reproducing itself every 3 months or 4 months, whatever the periodicity is for the particular publication? So, in other words, how did you expand from this materiality to that liveliness again? And how did the materiality help you reveal things about the magazine that would escape a kind of intentionalist account, something that this anthropomorphizing could so easily lead to? Just, what were the intentions? And this is what they failed or they didn't fail, but more like the life of the magazine as a magazine. I hope that's clear. If not, let me know.
Yeah, I think that was quite clear. And I would answer the last of your questions with a little view on the way how we're studying periodicals these days. I mentioned that a bit earlier. Studying periodicals has been something quite dull or marginal, let's say, until before 15 years pretty much, and not just in the field of Arabic culture and history, but also in other fields like European history. And there have been like a lot of developments within the last 15 years to look at this format in another way, not to take it at face value. I think this is maybe the major shift in the way how we look at magazines today, and how I try to look at this particular magazine. So not just look into what is written in text, but also to understand how the material and as form is composed. The paratextual level then becomes very important. The design level becomes important. The community building and community dissolving behind the magazine. So the whole social world behind this material object that becomes interesting. And this is also what makes the materiality of the magazine so complex, is that every issue is in a way a particular moment catched in its own history. and you look into one issue and you try to reconstruct it in a way. And this is part of the why doing magazine research is so tempting. It is always like a time machine. Everyone who's ever done archive work with magazines knows that. But regarding your question, how I approach the material, there are collections of mawaqif also in Beirut at the Orient-Institut. UB has many issues, but very often the way how they are archived, they cut out the title pages, they cut out important parts of the paratextual level. Of course, it is always like a treasure to find one historical copy not being archived within a collected.
And Yvonne, tell us more what you're referring to as paratextual. Goes something that is not quite the textual, but it's not against the textual. What is the paratextual?
The paratextual within a magazine issue is, of course, it's imprint, for example. It's the table of contents. It's the little page where you learn about the prices in the different countries the issue is sold. So let's say the economic background and the travel paths of the magazine. Advertisement becomes interesting. Do we have advertisement? And if so, what is advertised? Like that is also something interesting, especially in the case of independent magazine publishing, like we have in the case of Mawaqif, Al-Adab, Sha'ar, all these magazines, but still they would do advertisement.
Yeah, not government.
Yeah, but what they would do is they often look at the literary field or the cultural field, look at their peers, show their works, do advertisement for a new book release. And these things become also interesting to reconstruct the literary field of one particular point in time, what the magazine allows for. Basically, everything becomes incredibly interesting beyond the article level, you can say.
Okay. So I stopped you on paratextual, but you were also mentioning design and community building and community dissolving. And I remember when you were presenting, you talked about the cover, the entire set being held at, for example, the home of Walid, the artist. Right? And so this kind of materiality, this paratextual life of the magazine, is something that allows you to follow it beyond just this, beyond the possibility of a person, that charismatic person who's sitting in his office, say, or her office, because Khaled Said was an editor too. Tell me or help me understand more about the relevance, the importance that you learned, what you learned from the magazine by paying attention to its design. And if you have any covers, I've pulled up one to share. And I also pulled up your blog, Truffle, which has one cover. But I don't think I can find anything from the inside the magazine online easily. Yeah, let us get a little more concrete with that materiality and how it helped you learn things about the magazine.
What I learned, one of the covers I liked the most or find the most interesting, all of them are beautiful, especially the early ones, because today we like, for several reasons that we could also talk about quite long, we like the design of the 60s and 70s. It is...
Because it's 50 years ago.
Because it's 50 years ago, because it reminds, it's a local nostalgia maybe about a time when, before 1975 in Lebanon, but it's also a global thing. I could tell you the same about Germany, like it's the 60s, the long 60s and 70s are something we like to look at and touch, and particularly within print culture. And then when we follow the magazine throughout its time and we go into the 90s, that also changed a lot. So the visual arts became very present on the covers due to the new technical possibilities the editors get, because in Paris, when Mawaqif was published from Paris, they were published with Saqi House, and you couldn't consider it any more independent in that sense. So it became a very shiny, glossy magazine. It really changed just on visual terms. One cover that I really liked and that tempted me to understand it as an echo of its moment was The issue, I really have to think which number that was. I don't remember. The issue that came out in early 1983 after the Israeli invasion of Beirut in Lebanon. So the magazine has a motto with which it started. It was for freedom and innovation and change. And usually this motto was, sorry.
I'm here. Can you not hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, sorry. So the magazine has a motto for revolution and freedom and change, and it would usually put the motto at some point on the cover page. But then in this issue after the Israeli invasion, where this whole issue was a very heavy one. It was a moment of, I don't know, like real despair, and you could feel like the historical moment that was experienced. And they made a cover where you could still see the motto in calligraphy, but it was so light that you could nearly recognize it anymore. So it communicates on its visual level, but yeah, in a way indirect and not immediately visible slogan or, yeah.
So they're using the visual capacity of the cover to trigger an experience of, can you believe your eyes, or you have to really look? Do you want to look more, maybe?
This is how I looked at it. This is, again, the interesting part. How do we make sense of what we actually see in the magazine? What could have also been a reason, like, I don't know, a lack of ink? This is, again, of course, it was my desire to read this. Yes, it was my desire to read a lot of things in this magazine and to make sense of a medium which in the end will never make sense because it is such a heterogeneously composed thing. And yeah, this is part of the struggle.
That's such a great point, Yvonne. There's an anthropologist named Webb Keane who has worked in Asia on symbols in politics, flags, and things that people trade. And he talks about the vulnerability of giving something to someone else, because if you meant to give them a good gift, but as you're handing it over or you're carrying it to them, because it's a material thing, it's not just an idea or words, it can fall apart. It can tumble over and be slightly damaged. It can get ripped. And then is that part of the thing you're giving them? Or how do you manage that? Suddenly what you wanted to do and what you have in your hands are different things. And you can never control a mobile thing entirely. So to risk going into publication format, particularly a periodical that has to come out again and again, is to become extremely vulnerable to what sense other people make of it as they're using their senses, right, to try and figure out what they should do with this thing.
I agree.
So I think it's a great point. Yeah.
And I agree, and particularly in serial publication or periodical publication, the whole idea of periodicity is built on expectations. You start with the first issue, and then you set the first expectation. You give yourself a name, and this establishes a certain kind of, okay, what will follow afterwards? So there is a huge pressure for the periodical editor or the magazine editor to bring out every, let's say, in this case, 4 times per year, 5 times per year, a thing that is, that shows a certain kind of consistent quality, if you want to call it quality. And of course, that is impossible. It's just completely impossible.
Yeah.
And yeah, a colleague of mine who had a very, Roman Schmidt, he did a very great research on Lettres Internationales, the trilingual European cultural magazine.
Yeah, which is in part produced, it was just something that Algerian artists became closely connected to, I think, in the 60s, right?
I think, yeah.
That situationists later on. Yeah, okay.
So it was published pretty much in the same time, Mawaqif as well. And he had this very great metaphor again for how a periodical comes into being, or what we can perceive of it at all. So what you usually as a reader perceive is the guest room. When you go into a restaurant, you sit at the table and you get a certain meal and it tastes good, or it might not taste that well. But what you will never get to learn is the kitchen. So how
Right.
did this particular meal come into being? What spices have been used? Has this spice been used because it was the only one present, or because it has to go into that meal? What were the decision making of the cook, and so on and so forth? So the kitchen is a black box. And so when you do periodical research, there has to be this level of reflection that whatever you do and whatever you tell, it is, as basically in every kind of research, but here it's so obvious, pure assumptions. Because if you're not, you do not have access to the archive of the editors, like the letter exchanges, the whole kitchen, so to say, then it's impossible. And in my case, I didn't have the access because it was just not possible in that time. Yeah, but again, that would have been a whole other part of material to include all the letters between one editor and the other in 25 years.
We don't have much time left, Yvonne, but I'm intrigued to know more. Did you talk with the editors about that backspace, the kitchen? Did it come up when you were interviewing people? Did it intrude on their role as editors or their experience in their project with the magazine? And I have a colleague who would say, when we're teaching students to do research anthropologically, to think a lot about the technologies by which we do our research, but also by which people create their lives, because, and he quotes Heidegger saying that techne is a means of revealing. So it sounds like that kitchen, if you could open it up, would really reveal much more than what you necessarily want people to think about between the covers. Yeah. So I'm just wondering how people referred to it. Like, how did the materiality of the magazine figure in your conversations with people?
So I have had conversations with former editors. Several of them, of course, they were like, today it's for them, it's again 25 years ago that the last issue has been released, quite some time ago. So they have done other projects. Memory is an issue. And also how these friendships that built the magazine have developed or changed have been an issue in retrospective. So I would say the most interesting part for me was not what these conversations gave me in terms of knowledge about the production process so much. There hasn't been that much useful to understand the magazine or one issue in a particular year, but it has been very revealing in the sense what magazine making, doing magazines actually means for cultural actors, for these kind of cultural actors of this generation, born between the 30s to 50s, early 50s, how important it has been for their own intellectual endeavor. So these people are usually or much more known as writers, for example, as artists. But the amount to which this collective joint endeavor of doing a magazine together has shaped their understanding of their very activity as intellectuals is what is revealed both in the magazine as a materiality, but also in the retrospections of these actors as a practice that is for them lost in a way, because now in the digital age, who is doing print magazines, it's true in a certain way, it might be true. But then again, we see a very contemporary interest also in Lebanon and Beirut, but also here in Germany for doing print magazines.
Yeah.
And there is something in the print, the aura of the print medium, if you want to say, that cannot be substituted by a digital magazine, an online magazine. And there would be another episode.
That's one where we have to throw a curveball at Walter Benjamin, but that would be great. Okay, Yvonne, it's been really great talking with you. I've been looking forward to this chance to follow up from our summer school last year and your presentations and your presence there. And I hope to hear more about where you're going with your research.
Thank you, Kirsten. It has been a pleasure.
This is a Moving Biography podcast, bringing together different perspectives to question disciplinary assumptions and decentre life writing. It is a collaboration between LAWHA at the Orient-Institut Beirut, the American University of Beirut, and the Global Decentre, generously funded by the Volkswagen Foundation.